Well, we are starting this new series on pride, and I'm just going to begin by asking you a question. Have you ever done something just out of pride where you looked absolutely stupid? Anybody ever done anything like that? No, okay, good. A few years ago, I was invited to come to Dallas, Texas to kind of get into a think tank with 10 pastors. There were going to be 10 of us from 10 of the largest churches in America. Now, there's something you need to know about pride, and we'll talk about it in this series. Really, the root of all pride is insecurity. Regardless of what you're going through in life, if you're dealing with pride, the root of it is insecurity. And one of the great fears I have in life is not spiders and it's not snakes. It's pastors. I just am uncomfortable around pastors. I've always been insecure around them, intimidated by them. And now I'm supposed to go to Dallas, Texas and spend 5 weeks over 2 years with 9 other pastors that I am scared of. And so finally I have some staff that go. It could be good for you. It could be good for the church. Some personal friends says you should go. This will maybe help you. And so I decided to go. But even as I was getting ready to go, I was nervous about it. How was I going to be able to impress them? Was I going to be accepted by them? And so this is how shallow I am. I had just gotten a brand new pair of cowboy boots. Now, these were fantastic cowboy boots, okay? They were just gorgeous boots, and I thought, if anything will get me into the clique, it's gonna be these cowboy boots when I show up in Dallas, Texas, wearing these bad boys, right? So I get up in the morning, I'm flying out of RDU, I put on my boots, my jeans, I go to the airport. As I'm walking down to my gate, I see a shoe shine stand. And so I'm like, I'm gonna get these boots polished up. I mean, if I'm gonna show up, I'm gonna look good. So he rolls my jeans up, he polishes the boots, they look beautiful. I pay him, and as I'm walking to my gate, I notice people are looking down at my shoes. And I'm like, oh, they like these boots. These things are working, right? And then I walked by a window where I saw my reflection, and he had rolled my jeans up to the top of my boots and never rolled them back down. So I'm walking through the airport with my jeans almost rolled up to my knees with my cowboy boots on, right? And I felt like the biggest idiot in the world. But we do stupid things like that when it comes to pride. But here's the other thing. Sometimes we make decisions out of pride that can literally set the course of our lives. So we're going to do this series. It's called Pride, the Original Sin. But I want you to know something. I could have just as easily named this series Pride, the Universal Sin, because every one of us struggles with pride. I believe that it is the number one sin that Satan uses to take us down as Christians. It's pride. I don't care what your personality is. I don't care what your race is, your demographic. We all struggle with pride. In fact, I'm going to make a statement here, and it may shock you a little bit, but it's going to be a truth that we're going to get throughout this series. We are never more like Satan than when we walk in pride. In fact, and I know this will shock you, pride is satanic. When we walk in pride, it's satanic. And you say, well, Mike, that's a harsh statement. Well, satanic just means like Satan. We are never more like Satan than when we walk in pride. But here's the good news. We're never more like Jesus than when we walk in humility. And I know what everybody's thinking. Well, I don't want to walk in pride. I want to walk in humility. So that's what we're going to be talking about in the series, timely series for all of us. One as individuals, but also as a young church that God is blessing incredibly, because we have to make sure, how do we not become a prideful church? Because I can assure you of this. Churches can become prideful. So that's what we're going to be talking about in the series. Now, the series is going to be based on 4 kings in the book of Daniel. It's 4 Babylonian kings. The first one's name is Nebuchadnezzar. Next week, we're going to talk about Belshazzar. The next week, we'll talk about Darius. And then the last week, we're going to talk about Cyrus. That's my favorite. I wish we could start with Cyrus, but we're going to have to wait to the grand finale to cover Cyrus. But every one of these kings, their lives are covered in the book of Daniel. But this is what's interesting. Daniel was able to have an impact on each one of these kings. Now, let me give you a little bit of the setting. The story takes place during this period of Jewish exile known as the Babylonian captivity. It was a time that God said for 70 years, you are going to go to Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes in, he conquers Jerusalem, and he takes a lot of the exiles back into the land of Babylon. And when this happened, whenever you're reading the Bible and you read something like this, you think they're going into captivity because God is punishing them. But I want you to understand something. God isn't punishing. He's actually disciplining them for their good. In fact, let me let you in on a little biblical truth. As children of God, God never punishes us. And the reason that he never punishes us as his children is because, see, he's already punished Jesus on our behalf. But I tell you what he will do. He will discipline us when we need an adjustment. He will discipline us when we need a correction. And maybe you had a parent like that who understood the difference between punishing and disciplining him. You knew that when they disciplined you, that it was coming from a place of love. It was because they had your good at heart. They saw an attitude adjustment that needed to be made, or maybe a correction in behavior, but it knew it came from a place of love. So understand, God is not punishing them. He's correcting them. He's helping them make some adjustment. So why is he doing this? Well, first of all, it's because the principle is very simple. God, when he established the nation of Israel, after they came out of Egypt, he said that every seventh year was to be a sabbatical year. Now, we talked about this when we went through our 10 Commandments series, and we talked about remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. But God also established a sabbatical year, which meant for every seventh year, they weren't supposed to work the land. They weren't supposed to plant crops. They were to let the land just sit there. And God had a couple of reasons for this. One was to make sure that the land stayed fertile. But the second reason was so that they would have to trust that God was going to provide for them on this sabbatical year. This is the problem. The Hebrew people chose not to observe the sabbatical year. In fact, they skipped 70 sabbatical years. So 70 sabbatical years. One's supposed to take place every 7 years. Okay, some of you are already doing the math. That means that for 490 years, they did not observe this sabbatical year principle. Now, you want to talk about the patience and the grace and the mercy of God. 490 years. So let me ask you a question. If you did something for 490 years, at some point, would you begin to think that maybe you're going to get away with it? Naturally, we would. But see, when it comes to God, you don't get away with it. So after 490 years of being patient with the people of Israel, he said, listen, I got to put you in timeout. And he puts them in timeout in Babylon for a period of 70 years. But again, I want to remind you, it's not because he's punishing them. He's helping them make this adjustment, this correction for their own good. For example, if we all got in a car and drove over to NC State and talked to some people in the agriculture department or some farmers or some scientists, they would tell you that you have to let the land rest. If you don't, it's going to become less and less fertile. God knew that, but think about this also. This means that if God had not stepped in, that Israel could be a barren wilderness if God had not allowed the land to catch up. Now, someday maybe all of you will get to go with me to Israel, but if you could go to Israel, you would see that it is anything other than a barren wilderness. In fact, this desert country, by the way, it's the only Middle Eastern country that doesn't have oil. How interesting is that? But when God gave it to Moses, he said it's the land that flows with milk and honey. And so if you go to the Middle East, you'll find all of these basic barren wildernesses, and then you have Israel. In fact, I have just a list of things, the crops that are grown in Israel. Okay, apples, avocados, bananas, bell peppers, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, celery, cherries, chili peppers, cucumbers, dates, eggplants, fennel, figs, garlic, grapes, grapefruit, lettuce, loquat, mandarins, all kinds of melons, mushrooms, nectarines, olives, onions, oranges, pears, persimmons, pomegranates, potatoes, radishes, scallions, strawberries, and summer squash. And that's just to name a few. It is literally a land of milk and honey. That is what God had promised to them. And so God says, we've got to do it my way so that you remain a fertile country. Now, this is the principle I think we should get. Anytime God disciplines you, he does it not just for your own good, but he does it for the good of your descendants. When God punished Israel, he was doing it for the good of their descendants. I'm going to tell you something. When God punishes us, there are times in our life that he not punishes, disciplines us. He does it not just for us, but for the good of our children and our grandchildren. So we don't pass certain things on to them. But during this time when God is disciplining us, understand Satan is always attacking us. And why is Satan attacking us while God is disciplining? Because Satan sees us as vulnerable. And let's be honest, we are vulnerable. And so as we're going to see in this story, even when God is disciplining us, God is still protecting us. And God is still providing for us. In fact, we have two famous stories in the book of Daniel that remind us that while the people of Israel, while they were being disciplined by God in exile in Babylon, he was still protecting them. He was still providing for them. And even people who don't go to church, they know these two stories. In fact, you know these two stories. The first one is Daniel in the what? Lion's den. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in what? We weren't as good on that one, but the fiery furnace. Now, this weekend, I want to kick off the series by giving you 3 indications or 3 signs that you may struggle in this area of pride. And we're going to see it in the life of King Nebuchadnezzar. But let me first tell you why I decided on this title, Pride the original sin. And it's because pride, when you think about it, pride was the sin that made Lucifer fall. Let me show you something interesting. Isaiah chapter 14, verse 13, it says this, you said in your heart, and here Isaiah is quoting Lucifer, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mountain of the assembly, on the mount utmost heights of Mount Zaphron, which is, by the way, is the most sacred mountain of the Canaanites. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Now, if you take the time to count it, you'll see that Lucifer said, I will 5 times. So in Isaiah, Lucifer, he's on an ego trip. And what we see is he is trying to elevate himself above God. And as a result, God kicked Lucifer out of heaven. That's when he became Satan, when he fell to earth. But let me take it one step further. When Satan showed up in the Garden of Eden to attack Adam and Eve, guess what he used? Pride. How did he go about using pride? He said this to them, God's holding out on you. God's not telling you everything. The reason he doesn't want you to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is because he knows that if you eat from it, you'll be like him. And by the way, this is one of the few times Satan never told the truth. Because in reality, when they did eat from the tree, the fruit from the tree, they did become like God in the sense, for the first time in their existence, they knew the difference between good and evil. And they knew that because they were now walking in the realm of disobedience and evil. So I believe that pride is probably still the number one way that Satan tries to tempt us. So I want to give you 3 signs or 3 indications that pride may have a foothold in your life. Now I'm going to tell you, in this entire series, we're going to read the Bible a lot. I know what you're thinking. How weird is that? We're reading the Bible in church. Okay, but I'm going to read the Bible a lot. And I'm pointing that out to you because I think when I read the Bible, most of you start thinking about what you're doing this afternoon, or you got to get the oil changed in your car, whatever it is, right? But I want you to follow along as I read it because there's going to be some things that are going to pop out that maybe you've never seen before. So we're really going to spend a lot of time. So here's the first sign of pride. You don't give God the credit for what he does in your life. That's the first sign that you may struggle with pride. Let me show you. Daniel chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, so that's 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now watch this verse very carefully. Verse 2, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim. The Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Now, why did God do that? It's because, remember, God is disciplining his children. But here's the thing. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't realize that God is actually doing this for him. He thinks it's because his strength. He thinks that it's because his might that he's taking Jerusalem and the exiles into captivity. But literally, God is doing it for him. So understand, that's pride. And so when we don't give God credit for everything that he's doing in our lives, we're prideful. For example, when we take, for example, credit for our intellect, we take credit for our abilities, or we take credit for our accomplishments, that's pride. But think about it. None of us, as we sit here today, we didn't get to choose our genetics. We didn't get to choose the quotient of our intelligence. We may have worked really, really hard. We may have gone to school and studied really, really hard. But see, we didn't get to choose what IQ we started out with. Think about this. None of us got to choose the time and history that we would live or the place that we would live. Every one of us could have been born in the Central African Republic instead of being born here in the United States of America, where we have all of these opportunities. So let me tell you, if you were born in the Central African Republic, where we just drilled a well this year, your average household income is $240 for a year. Process that, people. The average lifespan of a man is 39. The average lifespan of a woman is 42. Your chance of getting any kind of education is 0. My point is simply this. You didn't get to decide when you live and where you live. In fact, let me show you an interesting verse. Acts 17, verse 26, it says, from one man, that would be Adam, he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their land. Basically, he's saying this. God chose when you were going to live, and God chose where you're going to live. My point is simply this. Everything we have comes from God. And when we don't acknowledge that, and we don't give God the glory and give God the credit, that's pride. Now, there are 4 familiar characters that emerge in the book of Daniel. There's Daniel, and that is his Hebrew name. And then there's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But those aren't their Hebrew names. They're actually their Chaldean names. And it's because about 60 years before Nebuchadnezzar swept in and conquered Babylon, the Chaldeans came in and conquered Babylon. And so Nebuchadnezzar was actually a Chaldean king. And so he calls these guys by their Chaldean names. But I want to show you how God uses these four men. Daniel chapter 1, verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Now notice how he describes them. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. Literally, he wants to bring in these sharp young men to help him run his kingdom. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. Now understand, that was Nebuchadnezzar's goal. And in fact, you can see where they got their names in verse 6 of Daniel chapter 1. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and that is the way you pronounce it, but it is a guy's name, and Azariah. The chief officials gave them names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. Next week, we're going to look at the king Belshazzar. And I'll let you know next week what's the difference between Belteshazzar and Belshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. I once heard a guy preach on my shack, your shack, and a bungalow. Okay, that's not this, okay? It's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I am sure that when you think about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their parents had taught them the monotheistic, which just means one God, lifestyle of the Jews. Now think about this. These young men, when they were taken into captivity, probably were somewhere between 12 and 15 years old. Middle school, early high school years. That's when they're taken into captivity. So they've been taught the laws of the Jews, the rules of the Jews, the regulations of the Jews. But all of a sudden, they're plucked up out of Jerusalem. They're taken away from their families, away from everything that they're familiar with, and they're dropped into this free-thinking, decadent society of Babylon. And they're supposed to be taught their philosophy, their language, their literature. In other words, they're going to try to drain out of them all of their traditional thinking and replace it with all of this whole new set of morals and values. It's kind of like when you send your kids off to college. You know, you're kind of sending them into an atmosphere, into an environment where everything you've taught them, they're going to do everything they can to unteach them. And so that's what's going on with these young men. That's the situation they find themselves in. Well, as time goes on in our story, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. You're going to see these guys have lots of dreams, okay? And he calls in the wise men and says, not only do I want you to interpret my dream, I want you to tell me what my dream was. And if you're really, really wise, you ought to be able to do this. Now think about this. King Nebuchadnezzar was smart. He had been calling in these wise men saying, hey, I had this dream. And they're saying, oh, let us tell you what it means. And he's like, I don't know if that's true or not. But now he says, if you're really wise, you ought to be able to tell me what my dream was and then also interpret my dream. So he calls in the wise men. They say it's impossible. So Nebuchadnezzar, he issues a decree that all the wise men have to be killed. You're going to see that's kind of how they operated. And since Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they fall into this category. They're now advisors to the king. So the soldiers, they show up at their apartment, knock on the door and say, hey, we're here to kill you. And Daniel's like, well, why are we going to get killed? It's, well, the king had a dream and the wise men couldn't answer the dream. And the king's really ticked off. So everybody's going to get killed. And Daniel says, well, hang on just one second. I have a God who can interpret his dream. So they take Daniel, they take him in front of the king, and this is what it says in Daniel chapter 2, verse 26. The king asked Daniel, also called Belshazzar, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Daniel replied, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. So immediately you can see the balance with Daniel. Daniel says, they can't do it. Honestly, I can't do it. But I know a God who can, and he'll use me in the process. But understand, not giving the credit for what God does is the first indication of pride. Now let me just say something about giving God credit. All of us say, well, I just want to give God the glory, right? I tell you, one of my pet peeves is I used to work with a young man, and every time he would stand up in front of the staff, he would always talk about, I'm just so humbled to be here today. I'm your humble servant to be here today. And I used to tell him afterwards, if you're humble, you don't have to tell anybody you're humble. That's fake humility. I remember years ago, I used to sing in a gospel quartet. It started out when I still lived in Southern California. In fact, that's the group that moved here with me to help start Hope. And we entered a contest. We won a national contest. We got a recording contract. That led to us traveling around the country and doing concerts. And I'll never forget, we were doing a concert in Indiana one time. And after the concert, we had a meet and greet with some of the people that were in attendance. And they came up afterwards, and a lady came up to me, and she says, man, she said, that was so good. And I said, well, it's all God. And she said, it wasn't that good. See, we say stuff like that, but the reality is we really aren't that humble. But when we take credit for what God is doing in our life, or we stop giving credit, it's an indication of pride. Now, here's the second one. It sounds very similar, but it's not the same. When you accept credit for what God has done in your life, you're dealing with pride. Now, let me just say something here. I'm not saying that it's not okay to be honored when you do something. I'm not saying that for some accomplishment. But understand as Christians, in reality, there's only one person who ever gets the credit, only one person who really gets the glory for anything that we accomplish in our lives, and that's God. Let me show you an interesting verse, Isaiah 42, verse 8. It says, I am the Lord, that is my name. I will not yield my glory to another or my praise to idols. This is what God is saying. I'm not going to share my glory with anyone. I'm not going to share my glory with anyone. So God makes it very, very clear. By the way, that's what Satan tried to do. That's what got him kicked out of heaven. He tried to take the glory. So Daniel, he interprets this dream, and he describes in this dream, Nebuchadnezzar had seen this large statue. And so Daniel describes this dream right down to the clay feet of the statue. You can read that on your own. But I want you to see what Nebuchadnezzar does in Daniel chapter 2, verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor in order that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. So again, you see the balance. Daniel's not taking the credit. He's giving the credit to God. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon, placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. So far, so good. That's the end of chapter 2. But when you get to chapter 3, verse 1, it says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high, so that's 90 feet high, 6 cubits wide, so that's 9 feet wide at the base, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And a lot of people believe that this was actually a statue of Nebuchadnezzar. But I will tell you this, if it was a statue of Nebuchadnezzar, it was a really, really tall, skinny dude, okay? Because it was only 9 feet wide and 90 feet high. That's a 10-to-1 ratio. To put it in perspective, the Washington Monument is also a 10-to-1 ratio. It's 555 feet tall, but it's only 55 feet wide at the base. And so a lot smaller, but that's basically what he built. It's obelisk. That's basically what he built there. So tall, skinny, actually, we don't know what it was. All we know is this. We know it was made of gold. And most theologians and historians believe that there was the image of Nebuchadnezzar on the top of this 90-foot monument or obelisk. And then Nebuchadnezzar makes this proclamation in Daniel chapter 3. He says, nations and people of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, this is Aerosmith, by the way. Oh, this is where they got all kinds of music. You must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So sure enough, the big day comes. They strike up the band. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, don't bow down. Everybody bows down. And then you got 3 guys not bowing down. I'm telling you, they stood out like Taylor Swift in a convent. They're just standing there. So they were obvious the spot, right? So somebody goes and snitches on them to the king, and he brings them in and says, whoa, whoa, whoa. Is it true? I heard someone told me that you guys refused to bow down. Is that true? And they're like, that's a fact, Jack. We did not bow down. And he said, well, it must have been a breakdown in communication. Maybe it was a language barrier. I'm going to give you one more chance to bow down. And so it says in chapter 3, verse 15, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, all kinds of music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Now watch this pride. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Now remember, he just made this proclamation about Daniel's God because Daniel had interpreted the dream. But now he's saying, okay, let's see what God can save you. So he really wasn't a believer in that God. And so basically Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego respond, listen, let me save you the time and energy. We're never going to bow down to that guy. You can play the song as many times as you want. We're never going to bow down to that image. So it says in Daniel 3, verse 9, then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. I'll say something about that in a second. And commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. Verse 22, the king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. By the way, let me just say something about the fiery furnace. When I was in Sunday school growing up, I'm old enough to remember the little pictures they had in our Sunday school classrooms. And the fiery furnace was always like a huge fireplace, right? And there was the fire, you could see the fire, and 3 people kind of standing in the fireplace. Well, archaeologists have discovered that it wasn't like that at all. These fiery furnaces were basically a hole in the ground. It was about 20 feet in diameter. It was about 20 feet deep, and each of them had a ramp where you could walk from the ground down to the bottom, I guess to clean it out or whatever they needed to do. So that's what's going on. And by the way, that's how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were able to walk right out of the fiery furnace. But then on the other, it says that it was heated 7 times hotter than normal. And they've also discovered that this was possible because at this time in Babylon's history, they actually had trees, and I can't remember the name of it, but these trees would burn so much hotter than any other trees. And I thought, is that even true? So I Googled it and I found, you know what? There's a whole lot of trees that they say that when these are in forest fires and wildfires, they're harder to put out because they burn so much hotter. So they had these trees in Babylon, they say specifically for an event like this, so that they could make the furnace this hot. I mention all that for this reason. The Bible is always accurate. The Bible is always accurate. I tell you, every time archaeologists find something, it never disproves the Bible, it always proves the Bible. So when the Bible gives you specific things about a story, I guarantee you can track them down and you'll find out it's true. So this is just simply one of them. And then it says this in Daniel chapter 3, verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that were tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, Your Majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. By the way, it's interesting. Remember how they were bound up? The only thing that burned were the ropes. The ropes dropped out. In fact, it says later on, when they came out of the fire, there wasn't even the smell of smoke on their clothes because Jesus was right there with them. Now, this is what really blew me away as I was studying this about King Nebuchadnezzar. I want you to think about this. King Nebuchadnezzar is not Jewish. He is not a part of God's chosen people. He's a Chaldean. Actually, he's a pagan. And what you see in this story with Nebuchadnezzar is God keeps trying time and time and time again to get through to him, to prove to him that I am the real God, the God that is worth worshiping and bowing down to. But then you have this whole fiery furnace thing. And Nebuchadnezzar, guess what he does? He issues another decree that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who's also the God of Daniel, is the one that should be worshiped. So he does that. Now, here's the problem. He would see a miracle, he would turn toward God, and then he would turn away from God. And then God would give him another miracle, and he would turn back to God. You know, we have a saying that says God is the God of the second chance. If you read the Bible, this is what you will discover. God is the God of the 2nd millionth chance. I mean, here's this heathen, Nebuchadnezzar. Now think about this. He has actually killed and tortured many of the Jewish exiles he took into captivity. I mean, this guy was like one of the original Hitlers. And yet here we are in this story, and God is still trying to reach him. And I just point that out for this reason. I don't care how bad you are. I don't care what you've done in your life. I don't care what your journey is like. I promise you this, God is still loving, in love with you. And he is doing everything he can to reach you and pull you back into a relationship with him. Now, let me give you the third sign of pride, and this is where it gets a little personal. Pride keeps you from speaking humbly. Let me show you what I mean by that. Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. And now, if I'm an advisor of Nebuchadnezzar, at this time, I'm like, okay, no more pizzas with anchovies right before you go to bed, because this guy is having dreams all the time. So he has another dream, and the dream is about how in 12 months from the time that he has the dream, God is going to show up in his life and humble him. So God gives him this dream of what's going to happen, and he says, it's going to happen in 12 months. You can think about this for 12 months. It's going to happen for 12 months later. And the way that God is going to humble him, if you know the story, God is going to make Nebuchadnezzar lose his mind. And he's going to end up living out in the field and eating grass like a wild animal. And he's going to do it for 7 years. So let me read it to you. Daniel chapter 4, verse 29. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty? So he's forgotten all about this God of Daniel and this God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You can just hear the pride. Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times, which means 7 years, will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people, and he ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. Now let's go back to what he said about his kingdom. Why is it so important that as Christians we learn to speak humbly? Let me show you an interesting thing that Jesus said in Matthew chapter 12, verse 34. He said this, for out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. We probably heard that verse. Let me read it again. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Now, when I was working on this lesson, I saw something in this verse I had seen, but I had never seen. You ever done that? Have you ever read the Bible, the same passage over and over, and one day all of a sudden the light comes on and you realize, oh, I've seen it, but I'd never really seen it. And that's what happened when I was studying this verse. And this is what I got. It's the word abundance. It just jumped out to me. I'd never really noticed it in this context before. It's the word abundance. So what I want to say is this. Every one of us say stupid things. I am the king of saying stupid things, okay? Every one of us say prideful things. And I've actually been a literalist with this verse till God finally corrected me, and maybe you have too. Somebody would say something mean to me or harsh to me, and then they would come back and apologize a few minutes later and say, I didn't mean that. Has that ever happened to you? I didn't really mean that. And this is how I used to respond. Yeah, but the Bible says the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. So it came out of your mouth, so it must be in your heart, right? That's just the way we are. But again, we all say stupid and prideful things. And so this is what I'm learning from this verse. What we say in an abundance is in the heart in an abundance. Let me say that again. What we say in an abundance is in our heart in abundance. That's the difference. In other words, even as Christians, we're humans. We're going to make mistakes. There are times we're going to say prideful things. But I will say this, if there is an abundance of prideful statements coming out of your mouth, then according to Jesus, there's an abundance of pride in your heart. You see that? And he's going to deal with it. That's the thing. He's going to deal with it. God always humbles people that exalt themselves, that walk in pride. And we're going to see it throughout this series. And the reason I'm telling you this is because if you have a problem speaking pridefully, in other words, if it's in abundance, and if you don't know if you do, just ask someone close to you. But if you have a problem in this area, you now know that you don't just have a problem speaking it. You know now that you have a problem of pride in your heart. And you need to ask God to help you deal with it. But this is what I love about the story of Nebuchadnezzar. Let me show you how it ends. Chapter 4, verse 34 of Daniel. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. In other words, as soon as he turns to God, God heals him. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. Look what he says. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, look at this, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. Now look at this. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. My principle for you this morning is this. God can restore a prideful person. I mean, we looked at this story this morning where God restores Nebuchadnezzar. And I'll be honest with you, God restored this prideful man. I went down a road where pride, I didn't realize it at the time. I used to think I was pretty humble. But then I learned later on, I was really just mistaking insecurity with humility. And that's not what it means to be humble. And I got to the point where I thought, well, you know, I might be the exception. Or I might be smarter than God on this one. But I'll tell you how you can really tell if you're struggling with pride. You'll begin to say things like this to yourself. I deserve this. I deserve this. And so I tell you what, God humbled me. But in the process, he restored me. And I'm telling you, God can restore you too. All you have to do is turn your eyes to heaven. And just like with Nebuchadnezzar, in that moment, God can make you whole. Now, let me tell you why this is important to us as a church. We're just a young baby church. We're still crawling. I mean, we're not even walking yet, right? We're toddler at best. But God has already been incredibly good and incredibly gracious. I mean, we've been able to meet in this beautiful restaurant for 2 years and never paid 1 penny. We even drink all of Ray's French press coffee, without him charging it for us. But even as God laid on our heart, maybe it's time to move and give Ray a break and move to East Cary Middle School. It's just been amazing to me how God has shown up. I told you somebody gave us a free trailer to use, so we don't have to buy a trailer. A sound guy that used to be my tech director, I said, we need a sound system. That's not going to work in a 500-seat auditorium. We love the karaoke machine, but that's not going to work. And like I said, it's not even ours anyway. We can't even take it with us. So we got to get a sound system. And I called this guy and I said, man, we have got a low budget. And I told you what churches typically spend on going to schools. I mean, usually around $150,000. And so he called me back and he said, I tell you what, I'm going to donate the mixer. And it's an analog digital mixer, but I'm going to donate. It's no telling what it's worth. But then I talked to the principal of East Cary this week, and we were supposed to move on August the 4th. And she said, I'm going to ask you to wait to November the 8th because teachers are coming back during that time. They're getting into their classrooms. They don't even know there's going to be a church here. And I graciously said, we'd be happy to wait. What else am I going to say anyway? But the minute I hung up, Shannon and I, well, God has a reason. God has a reason why we're going to be delayed. That night, I got a text from my tech guy, and he says, I think I'm getting your whole sound system donated to you, but it may take a couple of extra weeks. And I'm like, God's just taking care of us. God's just providing one thing after another. And God has just been so gracious to that way. But here's the thing. As God works, and as God begins to work in our hearts, but in our church, the temptation will be to start taking the credit. And it happens with churches. Well, look how good we are. We got this stuff all figured out. We better write a book. We better have some seminars. We better have some conferences, right? And all of a sudden, you forget that God is the one that opened these doors. God is the one who has built this thing. You're just kind of following along for the ride, right? And all of a sudden, you can become prideful. So this is my point. Regardless of what God does with Be Renewed Church, we have to always hold each other accountable, that nobody here gets the credit, that God gets the credit and God gets the glory. Someone contacted me and Shannon about a movie that's out. It's called Sound of Hope. I don't typically go to Christian movies because I think they're the cheesiest things in the world usually. But I thought I'm going to go to this one. And it's put out by the same people who are doing the show The Chosen. So I thought, hey, it might be pretty good. So last Sunday when we weren't meeting, Shannon and I went to the movies at 11:30 to see a Christian movie. She said, you're going to sleep the whole time, aren't you? I said, probably. But anyway, we got in there. This is interesting. And if you get a chance, you should go see it. It's a true story about a little African-American church in East Texas where years ago, and this, we're talking about a lot of poverty in this church, 22 families in this church adopted 77 children out of that county. 22 families, 77 children. In fact, to the point, one day the pastor called the county and said, we're ready for another child. And the lady that worked with Human Services, she says, we don't have any children left. You have adopted every child that needed a home in the community. And I walked out of there thinking, and I told Shannon as we were walking out, I said, listen, I'm not sure that's what God's calling us to do. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But I said this, I know that God can call us to do something great for his kingdom. And whatever he calls us to do, I just want to make sure we always understand that it is God that is doing it and not us, and God gets the glory. There are hundreds of families that make up East Cary Middle School, many of them low income, under-resourced families. And I believe that God is going to open the door for us to minister to many and many of these families. But I just want us to make sure, the first church I ever pastored, I had the wisest elder I'd ever met in my life. He's just incredibly, he was the picture of humility. But he told me one time when the church was small, he said, hey, Mike, let's dream. Let's do something so grand for God that it's absolutely doomed for failure unless he shows up. And that's our challenge for us. As we move forward, wherever this thing's going, because I don't have a clue. Whatever God does, however he shows up, however he blesses us, however he allows us to make an impact in our community and the world, let's just make sure that it is absolutely doomed for failure if God doesn't show up and do his thing. There's a good balance to this taking pride. I work really, really hard. If people come up and say, hey, I enjoyed your message today, I say, thank you. And it's because I work really, really, really hard. But this is something I learned a long time ago. I can work really, really hard, but unless God shows up and anoints what I say, unless God shows up and through his grace blesses it, it means absolutely nothing. So we can work really, really hard and we can think we've got everything just right, but if God doesn't show up, it's nothing. So let's dream big, let's think big, and let's envision something so significant for God and his kingdom that it is doomed for failure if he doesn't show up. But let's make sure he gets the credit and he gets the glory. Father, thank you for the chance we had to get together today, and I just pray that we'll begin to look into our own lives and say, is this an area, do I see myself as a self-made person? I am where I am because I got here on my own. Or are we really humble enough to say, God, it only is by your grace that I'm in the position I'm in, and I thank you. Do we approach you that way every day, Father? Thank you for another day. Thank you for another heartbeat. Thank you for another breath. And thank you for giving me the gifts and abilities that you've given me, and the time and the energy and the health and the income or whatever it is to do what you've called me to do today. May we learn to walk that way. And Father, not only that, may we learn to walk that way as a group of Christians, a group of pilgrims who are just trying to figure this thing out as we follow you. In your name we pray. Amen.